All right, so here we go. I'm going to talk a little bit about revising and editing your memorandum. So here's what we're going to do in order. First, we're going to talk about revising. Then we're going to talk about editing. And when we talk about editing, I'm going to talk about some writing pitfalls. Then we're going to talk about the final edit. Then hopefully you all will be on your way and start revising and editing your memo. That, of course, is wishful thinking on my part that you have it written already, but hey, I'm the eternal optimist. Okay, so I want to remind you before we get started what we talked about during the first 2 weeks of the semester. Legal thinking and legal writing is recursive, which means once you have completed a draft and you need to know that you have to go back to that draft and make sure that everything you wrote is still viable. And make sure that everything that you wrote is still what you think. How do you do that? You do that by revising and editing. But we'll talk about revising first. For purposes of today, I am discussing revision, which is how the memo presents as a whole. Then I will talk about editing, which is the nitty-gritty, word by word, sentence by sentence, page by page review of the paper. You should not try to do both of these things at one time, because that'll be way too much. I also suggest that when you do start revising and editing, that you take them bit by bit. So maybe revise your question presented, revise your brief answer, and then come back and edit your question presented and edit your brief answer so that you're not trying to get too much done at one time because you'll lose focus. Okay, so revising. When you revise, I want you to look at the entire structure of your memo. Have you stated your case as simply as possible in the question presented and the brief answer? Have you provided the reader with a roadmap of where your memo is going in the roadmap section? Do your facts and your argument flow logically, or are you jumping around? Have you taken out unwanted repetition? Does each paragraph in the entire document contain a single point? Finally, I want you to also make sure or structure that the facts that are in your statement of facts are not, let me back up, so that the facts that you're using in your application sections are not something that the reader hasn't read before. So I want you to make sure that every single fact that you rely on in your application sections are in your statement of facts. Next, I want you to edit for length. Review the overall length of your memo. Can you shorten anything without distracting from your case? I want you to look at your sentences. Do you have long sentences that are 4 lines or more? If so, can you break them up into 2 sentences? Same thing with paragraphs. Do you have page-long paragraphs? A reader is not going to read a page that has no paragraph breaks. So can you take that paragraph and break it up into 2? I want you to eliminate all unimportant dates and replace them with points of reference. So instead of telling me something happened on this date, maybe it can be 10 minutes later, maybe it can be the next day. Just try to remove all unimportant dates. Also, if you're giving me a quote, make sure that the quote doesn't contain any internal string cites. And if you quote a passage that's long enough for you to have to block quote it, I want you to tell the reader why the quote is important before you give the quote. Because as you know, as a reader, most of the time when there are block quotes, you skip right over it. So you need some kind of intro to a block quote, alerting the reader why what's in the block is important. Then I want you to edit for completeness. Can the reader base an opinion on the issue without doing any further research? Have you included all the relevant facts? Could someone who knows nothing about your case read it and understand your point? Is it complete? And finally, edit for clarity. This means that your memo needs to be ready ahead of time and that you have some time to look at your memo in with fresh eyes. Because if not, you do things like this. You write something like tables are for eating customers only. Hopefully that restaurant doesn't eat customers, nor do their clientele eat customers. When you read something on a computer, that's really easy to miss. So I really recommend that you print your paper out so that you can catch things like this. So let's talk about editing. The first thing I want you to do is edit for accuracy. So I want you to make sure that your cases are cited right. I want you to do more than just run a spell check on your document. Certain things are not caught by spell check because they are already spelled properly. So when you are proofreading, pay attention to things like the trial court, because trail is also a proper word. So word checker editor in Word is not going to catch that you said trail court instead of trial court. Same thing if you're talking about any statutes. I want you to make sure that it says statute and not statue, because here it says Florida Statute 316.0193. Statue is a perfectly good word. Word check or editor in Word is not going to find it. Make sure you do. Same thing if you wind up saying anything about the United States. Untied is a perfectly good word that won't get checked from word check. And finally, make sure that you spell the name of the party or the potential party you're going against correctly. I don't want to see any Walred, Walfreds, Waldred. The name of the potential defendant is Walreds. I also want you to edit out for legalese. I don't want to see any henceforth, heretofores, anything in Latin. It's not necessary for this paper. Take it out. And then I want you to pay attention to these other writing pitfalls. So I've put together a top 10 list of legal writing pitfalls. Number 10, we've talked about before. It is passive voice. Most of the time, legal writers use passive voice because they're trying to sound more official. But good writers use active voice. I taught you how to spot it the other day. Look for the word by, do a search for it in your search bar. Look for sentences or clauses that start with it is or it was. You can use the zombie test, etc. Nominalizations. Bad legal writers turn verbs into nouns and then add an extra verb to take the place of the one that they changed. So they say things like reached a conclusion. The case involved a collision. Instead, good writers just use the verb. So the court concluded. The cars collided. To spot nominalizations, I want you to look for words that end in ION. That should help you find a lot of them. People tend to be afraid to call things by their name, and they use generic terms like the plaintiff, on the day in question, the scene of the accident. Instead, give people their factual characterization if you're talking about parties in the case law. If you're talking about the parties from your case, then give them their names. And instead of saying something like the scene of the accident, be specific, say in the parking lot. Verbosity. Many times people say things that are run-on sentences. It has come to my attention from sources apart from yourself that you enjoy the water Pokemon Mudkip in some manner or form. Instead, just say, I realized or I learned that you like Mudkip. Here's a perfect legal example. The court in Chester Morris, a case involving a similar traffic accident, held that a person riding a bicycle must adhere to the same standards as a person driving a car, although it limited its holding to the facts of that case, which included the fact that the bicyclist was intoxicated. You can cut that down really simple, too. Chester v. Morris involved a similar traffic accident. The court held that a bicyclist must adhere to the same standards as a person driving a car. Period. New sentence. The opinion is limited to situations in which the bicyclist is intoxicated. So that one sentence on the top was turned into 3 sentences on the bottom, making it easier to understand. Number 6 is qualifying phrases. 1Ls and people that are unsure of themselves like to put qualifying phrases in the middle of sentences where they do not belong. If you have to use a qualifying phrase, I want you to put it at the end of the sentence, or you can consider eliminating them altogether. What am I talking about? So, the court, although it limited its holding, held that a bicyclist must adhere to traffic rules. Can we change the sentence and take out the qualifying language or move the qualifying language to the end of the sentence? Basically, on what's the qualifying language? Although it limited its holding is the qualifying language. So let's see. The court held that a bicyclist must adhere to traffic rules, although it limited its holding. Could be one. The court held, although with limits, that a bicyclist must adhere to traffic rules. How would you change that second sentence? Well, the court held that a bicyclist must adhere to traffic rules, period. Now, you can start your next sentence with, the court, however, limited its holding to, and therefore you take the qualifying phrase right outside of the sentence itself. Redundancy. A lot of times people use the same word over and over again. Notice, thank you for noticing this new notice. Your noticing has been noted and will be reported to the authorities. But there's also, on top of being redundant by using the same word, there's using, in an attempt to be all inclusive, using synonyms of the same word. So instead of saying every town, city, or village, you could say every municipality. Instead of saying null and void, you could just say void. Instead of saying each and every, well, each means every, you could just say each. Then there's obvious intensifiers. People think that it's persuasive and that it will make their case stronger if they use obvious intensifiers. The building is pretty ugly and a little big for its surroundings, or the holding is very narrow. He was undoubtedly drunk. Well, instead of taking out, and I think in your papers I said stop editorializing, the holding is narrow. He was drunk. If you want to get rid of obvious intensifiers, you can look for words ending in the letter Y, and that may help. So here, clearly an attorney is not an expert on what is a Doberman, and there is no showing in the affidavit that Squires is an expert on Dobermans. Whether Squires is an expert is clearly an issue for the trier of fact. Take out the clearlies. They are obvious intensifiers. They don't belong in objective writing. Number 3 are waffle words. Waffle words happen because the writer is afraid of being wrong, so they use these words instead of taking an actual position. What are waffle words? Well, maybe, at best, at least, seems to, perhaps, so-called, probably, might. Those are all waffle words. Take a position. Number 2 is using double negatives. You don't want to use a double negative. So here I didn't do nothing, a confession, because I didn't do nothing means I did it. But other double negatives, not uncommon. Just say common. Failed to show inability, which would mean showed ability. Not incapable. Well, why don't you just say capable? Much clearer and less words. And finally, the number one mistakes that people make in writing is what I call throat clearing. And that's using meaningless and usually pompous phrases to help get their point across. So I would like to point out that Chester v. Morris was overruled. Or it is important to note that Chester v. Morris has been overruled. No, just say that Chester v. Morris has been overruled. You don't need all that extra fluff. It does not help. And finally, for the final edit, it is very rare that a person can perform multiple editing functions on a single read-through, and even rarer that the person who tries to do that is correct. After you think that you have revised and edited your memo, put it down. Grab a cup of tea, grab a beer, I don't care. Then after a while, run through the process again. Remember, writing is recursive. Change the color of the print. Use a ruler. You know that I'm going to look through every single line. I'm not doing a quick skim. Do every single line. And with that, thank you. You've got this. I look forward to reading your final close memo, and I will see you soon.